This is the
Five Stars
Podcast.
Let me talk to you. This is such good shit.
Another week, another round of not-so-good wrestling news, and another week of insightful wrestling commentary here on the Five Starr Wrestling Report. Boy, do we have a lot to get into with this show, especially with this AEW stuff. As always, if it is your first time checking out the FSWR show, be it you're finding us on YouTube or Rumble, either way, make sure to stop in each Monday and Friday for new content. Got a lot of big stuff coming up for both podcasts. And if you are watching on YouTube, you can help out the show by liking the video, leaving a comment down below to share any insight you have on the topics at hand today. And do me a solid and just subscribe to the channel. Turn on the notification bell for when our shows go up each week. Again, YouTube in 2022, subscriptions don't really mean a whole lot anymore, but yeah, it just shows that you're going out of your way to support the channel, and would greatly appreciate any of the help that we can get. Today, we've got the Friday edition of the podcast, which means it's also our retro review deep dive discussion on NWA World Championship Wrestling and World Class Championship Wrestling. And of course, we always save the best for last, so that'll be saved for the second half of the show. But first, we've got to talk about the modern product and all the current stuff going on the AEW spectrum. And after the news that has transpired in the last couple days with Jeff Hardy, spent a whole lot of time sitting down and mulling over how I wanted to even address that whole situation, because I mean, as much as I want to say I'm not surprised about the whole thing, it's also kind of a poor reflection on Tony Khan's ability to make rational judgment calls. And moreover, I think that's where my issues really come into play with this whole thing. Because as much as we can sit here and point out the obvious, that Jeff's a fuck up and how he's solely to blame for the whole thing, how is it that we're not having a deeper conversation on how Tony Khan can even look at a guy like Jeff Hardy in his current condition and even want to sign that guy to begin with? The Jeff Hardy story of the substance abuse and the alcohol problems, those go way back in the time machine. I'm still old enough to remember watching him show up to a TNA pay-per-view completely intoxicated and going out there to embarrass himself in front of a worldwide audience on live camera. Jeff has had a very spotty track record for well over a decade now, and that is well documented. You can read up years later about the DUI charges. I think I read somewhere this is his third DUI charge since 2018. If y'all remember, there was that story that circulated right before WWE released him where he was acting really irrationally at a house show where he walked out of a match to the crowd, and there was all that backlash about the company trying to force him into rehab, but he didn't want to go, so they just let him go entirely. Probably knowing in the back of their minds that things were going to trickle down from there, and lo and behold, here we are merely months later reading about this. The point is, the guys needed help well before AEW ever signed him to a contract. I'm just trying to rationalize in my head how Tony took one look at this guy in his current conditioning and said to himself, we need Jeff Hardy in AEW right now. Fuck his health. Fuck the fact that his body is totally beaten up. Fuck the fact that he's probably in dire need of seeking help in some kind of rehab service. By golly, we need to book that long-awaited Hardy Boys Young Bucks dream match that all 200 people have been salivating to see. Even if the end result is Jeff gets hurt so bad in that match, he blacks out and doesn't remember a thing about the match after the fact. And we're going to turn around just 2 weeks later and try to book him in a ladder match on television with a bunch of other crash dummy cosplay wrestlers, thinking Jeff wasn't going to try something stupid in that match when we just saw him practically kill himself in a TV match with Darby Allin just weeks before that. Say what you want about religion. Whether or not you have any kind of spiritual faith or belief, that's a separate discussion entirely. But I don't know how you can look at the evolving story of Jeff Hardy in the last couple days and not believe that divine intervention did not step in to get him out of possibly killing himself in that ladder match. Because you all know, had that match actually happened as initially intended, and had Jeff gone into that match in his current frame of mind, he'd probably be dead right now. Because he would have tried something incredibly stupid, something would have gone horribly wrong, and that would have been the end of Jeff Hardy in terms of his in-ring career. That would have been the last you ever saw of him. The writing's been on the wall with this for well over a month now, but because Tony Khan's a fucking mark that has no idea what he's doing, he was actually willing to go through with booking Jeff Hardy in another fucking stunt show match with 5 other guys and not expecting something to go wrong. So you know what? This is probably a circumstance where I would make the case that God exists. Because only God was going to step in and say, no, enough is enough with this. Jeff, you're not doing this. Go get help, get healthy, and go live a long enough life to spend time with your wife and kids. Because it sure wasn't going to be Tony stepping in to say no. He was all on board with letting that train wreck happen. Yes, we still ended up getting the ladder match without the Hardys, and we'll get into it once we start running down the Dynamite program. It was still garbage, but it's right up the wheelhouse of the other 4 guys involved anyway, so it was easier to stomach. So at the end of the day, we can talk about Jeff Hardy until we're blue in the face. Yeah, the guy needs help. Yes, the guy has needed help for a long time now. And hopefully he gets it. But my focus right now is on AEW and that company's complete ineptability to see that. Red flags, warning bells flashing right in Tony's face the whole way. But because he's a fucking irresponsible prick that's more focused on his action figure-inspired shitty booking instead of looking out for the betterment of his employees, of course he signed off on it. It was a bad idea to book Jeff in that match. We all knew it was a bad idea to book Jeff in that match. Jeff probably subconsciously knew it was a bad idea to be involved with it. The only person that apparently didn't see it was the guy that's responsible for overseeing his own product. The one that everyone should be putting trust in to make rational business decisions. And he's the least responsible of the bunch. And I really do wish the best for Jeff. I want him to take advantage of that rehabilitation service, especially if AEW is going to be providing that service for him. It's the least they can do for the guy. He's got to be willing to go through the process, and it's going to take a lot of time and a lot of healing, but if there's one thing I know, he's got the family and the fan support to push him through. I was never the biggest Hardy Boys fan growing up, but I also understand how much they mean to the wrestling business. And I also understand how much they mean to the current wrestling fan base. A lot of these AEW fans watch the Hardy Boys and idolize them growing up, and I can recognize how important they are to the current market. I just don't want to see their legacies tarnished. I have no desire to ever see Matt and Jeff wrestle another match a day in my life, and I would hope that even if you're a diehard Hardy Boys fan, you would at least agree with me to an extent. At least agreeing that Jeff shouldn't be wrestling another match until he's fully treated and healed from all of his injuries. And even then, maybe not. So anyway, let's get going with this edition of almost extinct wrestling. Because I'll tell you what, without Punk or MJF around, this show may as well be extinct. The other thing I've been meaning to talk about for a while is sort of a follow-up to all the injuries that are going on right now. Not just with AEW, of course, but we got some guys in WWE that are dealing with some stuff right now too. But it's definitely hurting AEW's product a lot more. Because when you think about a lot of the guys that just worked that Double or Nothing pay-per-view and some of those top names that are not actively wrestling right now, it's a big issue. Obviously, we know about Punk. That's well documented. Then you got guys like Adam Cole and Bryan Danielson that have been rumored to be dealing with injuries for a while now, which is why we're not seeing Cole wrestle right now. Danielson has vanished entirely. I have no idea what's going on with Samoa Joe. I mean, things have been kept pretty quiet about him recently. But it's like, I don't know. You're reading about all these guys working hurt, how their bodies are beaten up, and in the same week, people have been talking about the whole working style of the modern wrestling product and whether or not it's conducive to guys' overall long-term health to be working this high-risk offense almost week in and week out. On the same show, Tony's booking a main event garbage match where guys are taking needless bumps through gimmicks and putting their bodies through more shit. I don't know. At some point, you got to wonder how much of it's intentional. Like, is Tony Khan actively trying to kill his roster by continually booking them in these dangerous, high-profile matches? Pretty soon, we might have to call this company All Extinct Wrestling. Because if they keep treading the path they're on right now, pretty soon their entire roster will be fucking extinct. I wish the opening match would have been extinct. It's Chris Jericho versus Ortiz in a hair versus hair match. For free, on television with about 2 weeks build. All because Ortiz randomly ran out on Dynamite one week and cut off like 1/4 of an inch of Jericho's hair. And remember when we were talking on Rampage, wondering when the last time it was we saw Jake Hager wrestle a singles match? I present to you the same question when it comes to Ortiz. In fact, I'll do you one better. Name me the last time that Santana and Ortiz worked a regular tag match on television. Crickets, right? I mean, the actual wrestling between the two guys was mostly fine. There was a spot early on where Jericho almost spiked himself on his head trying to do a top rope Hurricane Rana. Thank God Ortiz is strong enough to hold on to him to drop him safely for a powerbomb. Of course, it ends up breaking down into the proverbial brawl with everyone on the outside because, we can't go 1 week without guys having a random street fight on the outside and detracting from the actual ongoing match. They did do a nice little false finish with Kingston giving Jericho the back fist behind the ref's back so Ortiz could get a near fall. Would have been the perfect finish if they had ended it right there, but everyone and their mother knew that Jericho wasn't losing his hair here, so kind of took away from the believability of it. But I'll say this, I like the Sammy Guevara run in at the end. Comes out under the Fuego mask, hits Ortiz with a bat, and then Jericho steals the pin. I have no idea why it took him this long to catch on to the fact that Sammy and Ty should be heels on the show, but at least they finally went there with it. And the alignment makes sense. Although Sammy reuniting with Jericho again makes me wonder why they even broke up the original Inner Circle faction to begin with. It also kind of makes Daniel Garcia look like a non-entity in the whole thing because Sammy and Garcia are pretty similar in size. But Ortiz did the deed. He shaved off his dreadlocks and then he comically screamed blood and guts into the microphone and took all the emotion and drama out of the situation. And from this point, they cut away from everything and we never heard anything from Ortiz for the remainder of the show. We didn't get a backstage promo on his post-shave look. We didn't get the announcers selling the implication of the story. It was the usual one and done and on to the next segment. So then we got the Wardlow versus 20 security guards gauntlet match. And just so you knew that this was intended to be played for laughs, they did the People's Court spoof beforehand with Mark Sterling and gave me all of the information I needed to know that I was not going to need to take this seriously. Yes, this is indeed what they are doing with Wardlow post-MJF. He's doing goofy courtroom comedy with Mark Sterling. Now, I did say last week that I was worried they were going to drag this out for like 10 minutes and completely kill any and all of the momentum that Wardlow could have potentially had after the MJF program. Well, they definitely killed Wardlow's momentum. They just did it in about 4 minutes instead of 10. And of course, the whole thing's complete bullshit because while Wardlow is stacking the guys on top of each other to pin them, most of their shoulders aren't even on the mat. He's dogpiling everyone on each other, pinning guys on their stomachs. It's completely ridiculous. Most of his power bombs looked horrible because the security geeks are untrained, so they're either trying to potato him by not going up, or some of them went up too easily and Wardlow almost completely jerked them over his head. So, long story short, Wardlow pinned them all. The crowd mostly sat on their hands and didn't react at all. And apparently we learned that lawsuit cases can be closed if you just have the plaintiff powerbomb the shit out of the prosecutor's security team. Guess they don't teach you that in law school. God, is that ever a My Cousin Vinny quote? Anyway, then they had Dan Lambert and Scorpio Sky in the Skybox doing a heat promo on Wardlow. And that all leads to Lambert trying to send in 2 of his MMA guys to fight Wardlow, but I don't know, I guess Wardlow talked sense into them and they threw Sterling into him so Wardlow could powerbomb him. I once again would like to reiterate, keep Wardlow off the mic, guys. Just, please. It's not doing him any favors. He does not need to talk. Just have him smash guys and win short matches and basically don't do any of the bullshit you did with him in this match if you have any hope of ever keeping the guy over. Of course, who am I kidding? We all know they're going to fuck Wardlow up. It's inevitable at this point because they screw up everything they have. We had Dax Harwood versus Will Ospreay, which was an interesting match to say the least. By the way, Ospreay coming out for this match with the Revolution Pro Undisputed British Heavyweight Championship. Seriously, does everyone have a fucking belt now? And once you look past the fact that we just saw Ospreay lose in his debut match on Rampage in a tag match, I guess it's not supposed to count because he wrestled on the B show or something. I don't know. As I've stated a couple times, not the biggest Ospreay fan in the world. I've seen a good handful of his matches in New Japan, and a lot of them are very hit and miss with me. However, he's a great athlete, and he's definitely packed on a lot of muscle in the last several years. He also seemed to have modified his style pretty considerably from when I last watched him. Ospreay's a guy that's dealt with a lot of injuries over the last few years. I think just recently he was recovering from a pretty severe neck injury that almost ended his career. When you watch Ospreay's matches and you see the kind of style he works, you can probably put 2 and 2 together with that. And while I did not love everything about this match with him and Dax, it was good. I will give Ospreay this. He takes a hell of a back body drop. I used to watch AJ take bumps like that in TNA years ago. I never saw anyone get height off a backdrop like AJ used to, but Ospreay came pretty close to topping it. A lot of the match was built around the big moves and the dramatic near falls, which, fine. Ospreay's probably not going to be sticking around post pay-per-view, so you want to throw him out there and have him do the big main event, big offense match. I get it. It gives him a chance to show everyone what he can do at a high level. He's still got way too many of those Kenny Omega tropes that get under my skin, like the over-exaggeration of the hand gesticulating and the weird-looking facials. I think my biggest issue with the match is that because of the style Ospreay works, it kind of forced Dax to work a faster pace, which evidently leads to bad habits creeping in. The most obvious example being the spot toward the end where Ospreay did a springboard 450 onto Dax for a near fall, and then Ospreay's right back up on his feet like 10 seconds later to start climbing to the top again. But in order for Dax to cut him off, he practically has to lunge to his feet and run full speed over to the corner to stop him. Meanwhile, you realize less than 30 seconds prior, he was taking a 450 splash and not really getting a chance to sell the ribs. Minor things at the end of the day, but I enjoyed it for what it was. I hate the fact that they beat FTR again to put over a guy who's not going to be around 2 weeks after the pay-per-view. The Afterbirth angle was a whole different story entirely. And once again, they have to do the heat angle where it's guys just clobbering and fake fighting for about a minute until cue the music, big dramatic save. And who should be returning but the company mascot. Remember when I said Trent's a fine professional wrestler on his own and they should just have him do his own thing and keep Orange Cassidy off of television entirely because his shtick fucking sucks now? Well, apparently Tony heard my comment about that and said, "Up yours, Tommy. Here's Orange Cassidy in fresh dark denim." Goody goody. And does the same old song and dance we've seen a million times, minus the shin kicks. But the act is old, it's worn out, so of course, we got to be subjected to more of it in the lead up to the pay-per-view. And my God, dude, watching Dax and Cash standing there next to Orange Cassidy while Ospreay backs off, I legitimately threw up in my mouth. I'm not even kidding. What a complete disrespect to those guys. And by the way, we didn't even get to the best part. The match they announced for the pay-per-view. They actually announced it in the main event during the ladder match, but yes, on the Forbidden Door pay-per-view, it is going to be Will Ospreay versus Orange Cassidy. Of course it is. We do Ospreay versus Dax on free television, which actually could have been a perfectly fine pay-per-view match. But instead, it's Ospreay versus the company mascot, where they're going to do every overdone, played-out comedy spot in the book, and the match is going to suck 10 cocks. And I'll never want to see a Will Ospreay match ever again because of it. And I have to pay for it. So then we get the face-off between Jon Moxley and Hiroshi Tanahashi. Yes, they were promoting that Hiroshi Tanahashi was going to speak on this show. Riveting. And as it turns out, Tanahashi didn't say a lick during the entire initial exchange. Moxley's talking about all the insider stuff that only the marks are going to know when it comes to this program. He's been trying to get a match with Tanahashi for the better part of 3 years, but he's been ducking him. He says that the people call him the ace of pro wrestling, but that's going to change after Moxley gets done with him. Never mind that during the course of this promo exchange, they never really explained why Hiroshi Tanahashi would want to be the interim AEW World Champion, but who cares? Pretty soon after that, they hit Jericho's music so that he could come out and suck more of the energy out of the room. To be fair, it was probably the best promo that Mox has cut since he came back from rehab. He still had to drop the words blood and guts in there, which you just kind of have to roll your eyes at. And at the point Jericho came out, this is really where the segment died a death. Jericho's rambling about God knows what, name dropping a bunch of New Japan guys that I'm unfamiliar with. Some guy named Shota Umino, who's apparently the son of Red Shoes, the senior official of New Japan. I believe he referenced Minoru Suzuki at one point. Oh yeah, and I guess I should mention that during the Jericho promo, Lance Archer and I think they said the guy's name was Desperado. Yeah, that guy. They ran out and started attacking Mox and Tanahashi. Of course, Excalibur's there going, "Oh my God, it's Suzuki-gun! I need my bottle of lotion. This is so fucking awesome!" And, yeah, Jericho announced some 6-man tag for the pay-per-view. I have no idea what it was. I don't care. This whole segment went to hell in a handbasket. It's Too many guys, most of whom we've never seen on the show before, and you cross out with the AEW guys who are just kind of getting randomly thrust into these makeshift matches for absolutely no reason. I'm sure it makes sense to the 500 people that are still watching New Japan on a consistent basis, but for someone like me who's basically only tuning in once a year to casually watch the G1 Climax tournament, I have no idea what the fuck is going on with half these guys. More importantly, I have no idea why more than 50% of these matches are happening to begin with, or why I should care about them. But let's talk about something good for a minute here. Let's talk about Ethan Page versus Miro in the Some Atlantic Championship Tournament. And by the way, for the record, I didn't mention the glaring issue with them naming the belt the All Atlantic title, despite the fact that the tournament also features guys from Japan, which is nowhere near the Atlantic Ocean. I presume maybe Tony Khan would have looked at a globe at some point in his youth when he was in school, but who knows, maybe he was too busy fantasy booking with his action figures. Also, if we're being particularly nitpicky, I believe Buddy Matthews was born in Australia, which is an island that hugs closer to the Pacific and Indian Ocean. Just saying. Anyway, I thought the match was good for the time it got. I think most of it happened during commercial, but, is what it is. I wish Ethan Page wrestled more. The guy's a fine worker. He's got great facials. He works like a heel, and the guy's got actual size to him, which makes his stuff look more believable. The thing that sucks about Miro is that he probably should be a heel, but the problem is he's so damn good, it's almost impossible to boo him. It was a very simple match. Page worked over Miro's shoulder. Miro made a comeback at the end, gave Lambert a pretty weak-looking thrust kick off the ring apron, and then he locked in the extended camel clutch for the win. Not really a surprising finish, but it was the right call. The thing I'm still confused about with this whole tournament, and am I correct that the way it's working is that the guys that win their qualifying matches are going to be at the pay-per-view to wrestle in a four-way for the belt? I think that's what I heard them say. So apparently it's going to be Pac versus Miro versus the winner of Penta versus Malachi versus whichever two New Japan guys are wrestling each other. All right. I'd kind of prefer seeing Miro and Pac in a singles match, but, got to cram 1,500 bodies on this pay-per-view somehow. Dante Martin is apparently inhuman, and he's tired of being labeled as a potential star. So what is he going to do? Well, he's going to do a job to Jon Moxley on Rampage and continue to be just another guy on the roster. Then Britt Baker wrestled Toni Storm. It existed. Kind of a good description of AEW's women's roster in general. It exists. Toni won clean with the package pile driver, and then she did the stare down with Thunder Rosa. So hold on a sec. Just so we're all on the same page here, just trying to keep track of Toni's incredibly genius booking. So Britt pinned Toni in the Owen Hart tournament so that she could beat Ruby Riott in the finals on the pay-per-view. Also, Toni could just pin her clean on TV a few weeks later, and now it's Toni getting the title shot against Thunder Rosa. I think I got that right. You need a Rosetta Stone to decipher some of this booking. We had some more New Japan development with Hangman Page, Adam Cole, and now the new IWGP Heavyweight Champion, apparently, Jay White. Even though Page laid out the challenge to Okada, I guess politics came into play here, and now Okada's not going to be involved with the Forbidden Door pay-per-view at all. Hey, mad props to Okada. Probably sitting there watching all this goofy shit pan out on AEW TV and thinking, I got a reputation to uphold. I'm not involving myself with any of this trash. You know, the more I think about it, the timing of CM Punk's injury is pretty suspicious. I don't know, you think Punk may have been trying to weasel out of having to work that show? Just saying. So anyway, Page issued the challenge to Jay White, but Adam Cole came out instead. Speaking of White, my God. Cole looks paler and paler the more I see him on this show. Seriously, dude, hit a fucking tanning bed. Anyway, Cole's still trying to weasel his way into wrestling for the IWGP title, so Jay White comes out from the crowd to jump Page, lays him out with the Sister Abigail, or whatever Jay White calls his version of the move. And, well, then he tells us that he's not defending the belt against Page or Cole because, well, I don't know why. I guess he's a douchebag. All right. We did get a classic TNA line in here. I have the title, therefore I have the power to make decisions. So I guess that's Jay's excuse for not wanting to defend the belt. For some reason, the IWGP Heavyweight title grants you the ability to make your own booking decisions and figure out when you want to defend your own belt. So, sure, we'll go with that story. Or, you know, they'll just probably announce a three-way for the pay-per-view. All right. Guess we got to cover this TLG warfare catastrophe, or whatever they're calling modern-day ladder matches. A match that used to be enjoyable back in the day before they ended up reverting into the Dudley, Hardy, Edge, and Christian stunt show fiasco. And then everyone decided that every match involving tables, ladders, and chairs has to be a constant game of can you top this with all the high-risk carny bullshit. And by the way, when I say TLG, since WWE has TLC trademarked, I will now be referring to these gimmicks on AEW as TLG. Tables, ladders, and garbage. By the way, why were tables involved if this was billed as a ladder match going in? Because, why not? And if you expected this match to be anything other than the usual AEW car wreck crash dummy spot fest, you've either A, never watched an AEW show before, or B, never watched anything involving the Beta Bucks. Jungle Boy continues to be one of AEW's most frustrating projects for me. Someone that has all the potential in the world to actually be a breakout star, but problem is he allows himself to get caught up working with all the outlaw goofs, and it ends up hindering any of his ability to ever learn how to be an actual pro wrestler. The dinosaur is kind of a lost cause at this point, but whenever Jungle Boy decides to graduate from preschool wrestling and start working like an actual adult, I will be waiting to provide more prolific feedback. By the way, the match was rotten. Every stupid thing involving ladders and tables you can possibly imagine. I will always love the spot where the wrestlers voluntarily place themselves on top of a table so someone can put them through it with a splash. In this match, it's Nick Jackson kicking Luchasaurus in the head on the floor so that Luchasaurus could carefully stumble over to the table, climb on top of the table to perfectly position himself for a 450 splash from Nick off of the top rope. And of course, they can't ever do a match with one singular ladder because that would mean that they can't set up their goofy gimmick contraptions. And by the way, when in the fuck did it become a thing where the referees come into the ring to hold the ladder in place when the guys are trying to climb it? In my 30-odd years of watching wrestling, I don't think I've ever seen anything more preposterous. I'm not bullshitting you. There's a spot in this match where Luchasaurus is scaling the ladder with one of the Bucks on his back, and meanwhile, Rick Knox and some other official are in the ring legitimately holding the legs of the ladder so that it doesn't tip over while the guys are setting up their choreographed looking bullshit. How stupid. As noted earlier in the Ospreay match, this is where they announced him versus Orange Cassidy at the pay-per-view, and I burst out laughing. And, whatever, we'll just skip to the finish. They did a bunch of stupid shit. How about that? So the Bucks tip Luchasaurus out to the floor, so he goes crashing through the stacked up tables, one of which didn't break because, of course, it didn't. And then they hit Jungle Boy with the BTE, and they climb up the ladder to grab the belts. Yay, who cares? And, of course, as soon as the Bucks won, I looked at my clock and realized we still have a few minutes left of airtime, and the Bucks are already leaving. So what else could possibly happen now? And as soon as Christian Cage came out, I knew exactly where they were going with it. So he goes in there to help Jungle Boy to his feet, who's selling the ankle, being attended to by Doc Samson. And Christian helps him up. He brings him over to the ropes. And then once Doc leaves, Christian pulls Jungle Boy back into the ring and hits him with a kill switch. Great reaction from JR. You son of a bitch! Probably the most believable thing JR's done on this entire show in a long time. He actually sounded genuine for a change. And they had him do the concerto deal to close out the show, making sure to stay on it for a good period to show Christian's facials, which was good. It was a great angle. Predictable as all get out, but the payoff worked. If anything, I'll look at the bright side. It'll give Jungle Boy a chance to do a program with a real professional and learn how to actually work. I think the whole thing would have been even greater if the show already didn't have 10,000 other fucking things going on, but I mean, if they were going to close the show with anything, this is what they needed to fade to black with. Funny how it probably will have nothing to do with the actual Forbidden Door pay-per-view, yet it was the best thing on the entire show. And look, I don't like the Bucks. I think their matches suck. They're one of the most overrated, overpushed, air quote, wrestlers in the modern era. But the Jurassic Express title reign has also sucked, and they needed to get the belts off of them desperately. I would have preferred they'd have done it with Powerhouse Hobbs and Ricky Starks, two actual talents that could use the rub at this stage in the game. But the belts are off the Jungle Book crew. They're setting up Jungle Boy for a program with Christian. The Dinosaur, I can take or leave at this point, and whatever they do with the Bucks as champions, I really don't care. Hopefully the end game is to do a third match with them and FTR and have FTR beat them for the belts, because I mean, that's about the only good program that you're going to get with Matt and Nick Jackson at this point. For the love of God, I hope they don't keep the straps on them with the idea of awaiting Jeff to come back so they can do another Bucks Hardys match. Oh God, what if that is the plan? I shudder to think. Anyway, well, this show is all over the place, like usual. Better show than last week, but that's equivalent to asking which do you prefer, getting run over by a car or having your leg forcibly chopped off. They both suck, it's just which one sucks less. I have absolutely no hope that Forbidden Door show is going to be any good, but I'm honestly not even sure if it's worth harping on at this point. I mean, we all knew that we weren't going to be getting any high-profile dream matches or anything like that, which begs the question, why are we even doing the show to begin with? But if you're someone that knows what's going on with all this New Japan AEW crossover stuff, good for you. I'm sure you'll get more out of the pay-per-view than I will. So as we move along here to the retro content, NWA World Championship Wrestling from June 14, 1986. And after the classic Rock and Roll Express segment from last week, I had said that I was going to do some research to try and find out more information on the Rock and Roll Summer Sizzler contest and see how far they actually went with it. Mostly I was curious to see if they ever actually did this at any other point in the business. Well, they did. They did it in Mid-South Wrestling just 2 years prior. Now, to be fair, I think Bill Watts was a little more vigilant with how he did it, because the contest was essentially just a win-a-date portion of the Jim Crockett version in '86. There was nothing involving underage girls sending in pictures of their pageant dresses or anything suspect like that. But I'll be damned, I just kind of went in figuring, oh, there's no way they ever did a concept like this with the Rock and Roll at any other point in the business. Sure enough, watching an episode of Mid-South from the summer of '84, and there's Jim Ross and Boyd Pierce at the announce booth talking about the Rock and Roll Express Win-a-Date contest. Of course, I just started laughing because I'm less than a week removed from seeing them do the exact same thing in Crockett Promotions, but whatever it was, wrestling promoters love the idea of hooking up Robert Gibson and Ricky Morton with the young ladies. Once again, a concept that would totally backfire if they tried it in 2022, but in the 80s, before everyone went fucking crazy with harassment charges, something like this could be done, and guaranteed no one would bat an eyelash at it. And speaking of the Devils, our opening footage of the week saw brief highlight footage of the Rock and Roll Express completely dominating Ric Flair and Arn Anderson on an episode of Worldwide TV. And by the way, I know we talk about this all the time, how fans used to be so much more lively at wrestling events and how they pretty much pop for just about anything the babyfaces ever did to the heels. When I say that these people went ballistic watching the Rock and Roll hit Anderson and Flair with a series of drop kicks, I'm not embellishing that at all. There were probably no more than 1,500 to 2,000 people in that building. It may have been a sold-out Barclays Center during WrestleMania weekend. That is how fucking loud those people were. It still baffles me just how much the landscape of the business has changed in the last 30 or so years. And as we cut to the booth with Tony and David, they're going through their usual show opening hype, informing us that there will be continuation with the Rock and Roll Summer Sizzler contest, because if the concept wasn't ridiculous enough when they first introduced it, let's refresh the people's memories a week later. They also inform us that we will be seeing the debut of the Warlord, and right before bringing in Jimmy Valiant for an interview, they said that Ole Anderson would also be wrestling on the show, very momentarily in fact. So in came Valiant, and normally this would be the weekly part of the Retro Review series where I mark out for just about anything Jimmy Valiant ever does on this show, because he is normally one of the major highlights. Well, here's what he basically said. He said that he may not be of Indian descent, but he has a lot of Wahoo McDaniel's wild side on him. And he said something to the extent of, the Paul Jones army took off my braid, so now I'm going to take their skull. Yes, a beheading plan for Mr. Jimmy Valiant. I was half expecting him to break out the guillotine gimmick. Then they re-showed the pre-shaved and post-shaved graphic of Paul Jones, of which I still maintain that the bald version of Paul Jones is probably more preferable to the regular haircut he had going here in '86. And then he promised that someone's going to be a bald-headed geek by the end of the Bash Tour. And that took us to Ole and Arn Anderson versus Pablo Crenshaw and Lee Peak. Hell of a return for poor Ole. His first match back with Jim Crockett Promotions in well over 6 months, and he's wrestling Lee fucking Peak in his return match. It was a total extended massacre beatdown, and the best part of the whole thing is that the entire match was essentially built around Ole and Arn working over Crenshaw's arm. If you actually watch the match in a vacuum, they did the absolute bare bones amount of work as humanly possible, yet it still ended up being arguably the best wrestling match on the entire show. Isn't that odd? Working a body part in a pro wrestling match and it turning out to be the best segment on the entire program. It's almost like the boys used to know how to actually get over in the business and get the people emotionally invested into whatever they were doing. How novel. And the finish here, I love this finish. Arn puts Crenshaw in the standing armbar while Ole comes off the top rope and drives the knee into his arm. And right before Ole taps out Crenshaw with an overhead wrist lock, Ole sees that Peak is on the apron And I guess for good measure, he goes and clotheslines him off the apron, as if Lee Peak was going to try and run interference at the finish here. It's great seeing Ole back, now that we actually have a functioning 4-horseman unit instead of the 3.5 horsemen. It is a shame that Ole's only really a part of the crew for maybe another 6 or so months before they end up going in a completely different direction with the original group and replacing Ole with Luger. And then by 87, Ole was retired for a brief period and kind of dipped out of the business for a while, at least as an active wrestler. So that is followed with Ole and Arn at the booth, and they showed the rest of the footage with Ole running in to attack the Rock and Roll from the worldwide taping. And as Dusty runs in to try and make the big heroic save, he's immediately thwarted by all the horsemen. They all clear the ring of Ricky and Robert while they're ganging up on Dusty. And while Ole is driving the giant brace into Dusty's face, that is when they send out the baby faces to clear the ring. And at this point, they cut to a brief commercial. And as we come back from the break, Ole makes his big projection for the remainder of the year. He predicts that by the end of 86, Dusty Rhodes will announce his retirement. And then in an unintentional bit of comedy, he is so confident that he'll retire Dusty by the end of the year, he promises to buy the people free drinks and meals if they walk up to him in public and ask if he's the one that put Dusty out of commission. Was that supposed to be a heel line? Because, I know most people probably wouldn't be too upset about free meals or beers. And I just love through this entire thing. Ole's out there running down all the baby faces, promising that the Horsemen are going to run through everyone's heroes. They're going to win all the belts, and they're going to reclaim their status at the top of the mountain or whatever. And there's the studio crowd responding with, "That's right, you tell him, Ole." Remember when the people used to rave about how the NWO used to be the cool heels that everyone cheered, and how it was sort of a pivotal point in the business where these smart fans kind of took over as the main fan base? I guess we completely forgot that the fans were doing this like 10 years prior with the Horsemen, who, unlike the NWO, were actually cool heels, because the NWO were just a bunch of dorks that did goofy comedy and had lousy to mediocre matches. Meanwhile, the Horsemen were actually badasses and had great matches. Revisionist history, I guess. So then Tully Blanchard wrestled Kent Glover. Okay, so remember when I just said that the Horsemen had great matches? No, this wasn't one of them. It was at least short, but Tully wasn't getting much out of Kent Glover. He won with the slingshot suplex, and then because JJ and Tully are great douchebags, they also make sure to have Tully lay out Glover with a series of stiff jabs after the bell. Made even better by Tully doing a little shuffle dance as he knocks Glover out with the big blow. And then we had our first Rock and Roll Summer Sizzler update. For this segment, they ran down the first of the 3 contests, the Rock and Roll Look-alike contest. And it hit me looking over the rules and regulations for all 3 of the contests throughout the show. There were a lot of goddamn rules and regulations with these contests. I remember Tony mentioning the age bracket for the look-alike contest, as it opened to ages 5 to 13 for boys and girls. I neglected to mention that the photos had to be in a 4x5 frame, I guess so that they could fit in the postcard format, and all the participants were only subject to 1 entry, so I guess if they tried to send in multiple pictures with different postcard entries, they'd be disqualified or something. Which would have been a pretty great rib for the whole contest series if someone would have tried to have their kid dress up as Ricky Morton in 1 entry and then try to dress him up as Robert Gibson for a separate entry just to see if anyone would notice. I'm sure there were all kinds of loopholes that people tried to do with this thing. Ron Garvin versus Paul Garner. My notes for this match read as follows. Garvin twisted Garner like a pretzel for about 3 minutes. It is probably the most flexible experience Garner's had in his entire life. And then Garvin won with the knockout punch. Coming back from the break, we had a Dusty Rhodes interview with Bob Caudle from NWA Pro Wrestling. And it started with Dusty running down the Horsemen. Pretty status quo babyface promo. And then he randomly gets into a spiel about receiving a letter from a priest who had said that Dusty was borderline on raising hell. He says that in order to take down the Horsemen, it's going to take more than one man, 1,000,000 men, or 20,000 space Martians. And should it all come down to Ole and Dusty, then that's the way it should be. The whole thing is always made better by Baby Doll standing there when Dusty does these off-the-wall promos, and she's either looking unsure of how to respond, or she's desperately restraining herself from bursting out into laughter. And then we had the official debut of the Warlord, wrestling Brody Chase here. And for reasons that were entirely unexplained, he was accompanied by Baby Doll for this segment. And the entire match pretty much went as follows. Warlord picked Brody up over his shoulder and carried him around for a second. And then he put him down, picked him up for a press slam, and pinned him. Now obviously, the Warlord had a pretty substantial run in Crockett Promotions about a year later when he started pairing up with the Barbarian, and remember they did the whole Powers of Pain deal, Bob. Obviously a couple years after that, they were doing the same gimmick in WWF. But as far as Warlord's first run in 86 goes, I honestly don't remember a whole lot of what he did around this point. He was very new to the business here, so I think if I remember correctly, Crockett would send him to one of the smaller territories for a period of time until he got a little more ring experience, but I mean, considering how little he did in the actual match here, aside from a couple power moves, maybe he was a lot greener than they were expecting, so maybe they regret rushing him to television so quick. We had a Magnum TA promo, still with possession of the U.S. Heavyweight title, by the way. I believe he had been stripped of the belt 2 weeks ago in Story. And he basically did a fiery babyface promo on the Russians, which we've heard from Magnum about 1,000 times on this show in the last 6 months, so it's not really worth harping on. It's a very good promo, just not out of the ordinary of every other Magnum promo on Ivan and Nikita we've already heard. Oh, God help me. Baron Von Raschke versus Vernon Deaton. I forget, who wasn't on this same show that took a pot shot at Deaton in one of their segments? Was it Jim Cornette? I forget, but someone was taking jabs at Vernon Deaton at some point on this show. And to be fair, it's not entirely to blame Vernon Deaton because he was working with the Baron in this match. Jimmy Valiant ended up coming out to do a promo during the match. Of course, Valiant's first words when he gets to the interview booth, Tony Schiavone. Still not entirely sure if Valiant was butchering Tony's name on purpose or if he legitimately just didn't know how to pronounce his name. Either way, it's hilarious. And he's doing his regular bald-headed geek promo on all the heels, plugging his match with the Baron for the Bash Tour, a black glove on a pole match, just to refresh your memory, because in the year 1986, someone thought it would be a great idea to put the two most immobile guys on the entire roster in a match where they had to scale a giant pole and try to pull down a gimmick hanging from the top. Just figuring they weren't going to blow out their kneecaps trying to drop down to the ring mat. He let us know here that, for a fact, the loaded black glove gimmick weighs a good 30 to 40 pounds. To which I responded with, I know for a fact that is a bold-faced lie, and that was proven at the finish here where Paul Jones tossed the glove to Baron behind Pee Wee Anderson's back, and I promise you, I have lifted 30-pound dumbbells. This black glove does not weigh 30 pounds. So after Baron locks in the claw on Deaton for the win, Valiant tries to run over to signal Pee Wee's attention to the glove, but Jones clubs him from behind so the heels can start ganging up on him until Sam Houston, Denny Brown, and Ronnie Garvin run them off. And by the way, what a set of baby faces to make the save for Handsome Jimmy. 2 undercard guys and Ronnie Garvin. Yeah, they're affiliating him with all this. It is still amazing to think that it took them until the fall of 87 to actually put the world title on that guy. Good Lord. Cutting to the booth, we had Ric Flair out for a promo. And much like the Magnum promo from earlier, I can shave off a few minutes of review time here by giving you the Cliff's Notes bullet points. Flair sold the big return of The Rock to the show. No, that's not Dwayne Johnson. That's The Rock, Ole Anderson. He took some shots at Dusty, promised to beat all 14 top contenders on the Bash Tour, mentioned something about his $15,000 Rolex, and then he promised to fuck all of the girls after his successful title defenses. And when I say all the girls, I mean all the girls. Every single one. Hopefully just the ones that can legally consent. Up next was the deep dive into the Rock and Roll Contest Series, Part 2. The most suspect of the three contests. Words to describe it falling somewhere along the spectrum of unsettling to creepy to downright horrifying, especially looking at it through the lens of 2022. The Miss Rock and Roll Express contest, open to ages 14 to 17. Once again, photos cannot exceed 4 by 5 inches. All letters must contain the usual home address information, including the birth date of the female applicant, just in case. You never know. And I think I caught this right, but I believe Tony said that there would be 6 winners selected. One would be the official Miss Rock and Roll Express, while the other 5 would be the quarters. There would also apparently be a touring bus that the 6 girls would get to travel alongside Ricky and Robert. And it was at this point where I felt that I needed to go take a shower because I was getting very uncomfortable listening to Tony trying to explain this all with a straight face. So then we cut back to the ring for all 3 of the Russians taking on the team of George South, the Italian Stallion, and Rocky King. For the record, that's Ivan, Nikita, and Crusher Khrushchev, making his big TV return here after the unfortunate injury he sustained back in January on this very program. A pretty scary incident with poor Rocky happened right before the commercial here. There's a spot where Rocky is coming off the ropes toward Ivan, and I have no idea what the fuck either guy was thinking or what the game plan was, but I'm like 90% sure that Ivan dumped Rocky right on top of his head trying to flip him over for a back body drop. How this guy did not die, I will never know, but I think at that point he tagged out and never re-entered the match, so he was definitely shaken up there. And coming back from the break, they did some stuff for a little bit, and the finish is Nikita putting South in a sitting Cobra clutch and winning via ref stoppage. And then we had the best promo exchange on the entire show. Baby Doll is at the booth, and she's hyping up getting into the ring for a match with Jim Cornette. She's super confident that she can beat Corny because not only is Cornette not an athlete, but he's barely a man. Them's fighting words. So this promptly brings out Cornette to retort to Baby Doll's accusations, and it immediately begins with him calling Baby Doll a, quote, fat pig. Says that all she wants to do is get married, have kids, and stuff her face with candy, but she can't have any of that because no one would ever want her in the first place. Harsh. And this all leads to Magnum coming out to stand by Baby Doll's side before the heels back out. Once again, I must give Baby Doll mad props for being on board with them going to the extreme with all the name-calling back in the day. Obviously, I can look back at it and smile because I actually have a sense of humor, and I also know that this was all a work. It's highly unlikely that Cornette ever really felt that Baby Doll was a fat hog or whatever derogatory term he wanted to throw out there, but it also hits you with the reality check that there's no way on God's green earth that this kind of language passes on television in today's culture, and I don't know, it kind of just makes you shake your head that you can't even make jokes like this anymore just to stir up heat. Yeah, the thing that's really humorous and also kind of depressing at the same time, compare Baby Doll's body proportions to women today. Let's just say I've seen bigger. Much bigger. Shaska Watley and the Barbarian wrestled, as I wrote down here, Two guys whose graphics flew by on the screen so fast I did not even bother to write it down, but who cares? They both looked hideously out of shape and unkempt. My favorite part of this match is a spot early on where Whatley spat on one of the job guys while he was laying on his back, and the guy sold it. Classic. Only other thing I wrote down here was Barbarian breaking out a standing dropkick, which may not seem that impressive, especially when you see a lot of the big guys in today's business doing pretty similar aerial-looking stuff. But in 1986, seeing the Barbarian hit a dropkick in a wrestling match, not something you saw that often. That was followed with the second best interview of the program, coming from the Paul Jones Army. My notes beginning here with Paul Jones being Paul Jones and having no idea which camera to look into during the promo. Best line of the whole segment coming from the Baron, where he's talking about his training for the Black Glove on a pole match, and he says, and I quote, "My body is hard." To which I responded with, "That's kinky." And the final thing I noted here is that while the Baron is talking, they randomly cut the camera to a shot of the Barbarian, who is standing there, and there's really no other way to put it. He was being the Barbarian. He was snarling. He was twitching. He was being wacky. It's the best way I can put it. And of course, Shaska is shouting obscenities about God knows what. Like, I completely understand why people hated the Paul Jones Army stuff, and as the weeks progress, I do continue to find myself asking, why in the fuck is this program still going on? Aside from the obvious of them needing to give Jimmy Valiant something to do. But the comedy with this whole thing is too good for it not to be part of the weekly programming. And I'm honestly wondering if that's why they kept going with it for as long as they did. Like, I could totally see Crockett and Dusty watching this shit unfold every week in the back and be like, yes, daddy, now that right there is high comedy money. Just sitting there behind the scenes laughing their asses off of this whole train wreck TV. Then we had the Russians out for a promo, and they took a few minutes here to show the replay of the Sam Houston Crusher Khrushchev match from January, where Khrushchev blew out his ankle and put himself on the shelf. And it's made twice as better because Khrushchev was a heel and he was a lying POS. While they are playing this video footage, he's standing there the entire time blaming the Road Warriors. Even though we clearly see in the video that Khrushchev injured himself doing a top rope cross-body dive onto Sam and landing awkwardly on his ankle. But no. God damn it, it's those no-good stinking Road Warriors that caused this damage. And they're the reason that Khrushchev wasn't able to stand alongside his brothers to defend the honor of the six-man tag team trophy. Subtle things in the wrestling business that you'll probably never see again. Heels outright lying and distorting the truth in wrestling angles to try and skew things in their favor, even though the evidence clearly points to the contrary. So this whole thing was great. Then the Rock and Roll Express wrestled Art Pritz and Larry Clark. Ricky is still sporting the protective face guard here. He's really milking that injury angle from the Horseman beatdown a few weeks back where y'all remember Flair drove his face into the mat and busted open his nose. They also announced that next Saturday morning on the TBS Superstation, 8:05 Eastern Time, Robert Gibson would be wrestling Arn Anderson for the World's Television Championship. And boy, do I need to get my hands on a copy of that match. I imagine it's on YouTube somewhere, but that sounds like fun. I want to watch that match. Rock and Roll obviously won with the double drop kick. And then it's Bash Tour update time. And Jim Crockett Jr. is out there to plug some of the big matches, including the Best of 7 series with Nikita and Magnum for the U.S. Heavyweight title. And while he's plugging it, out comes Magnum to finally relinquish the belt. As we all remember from last week, Ivan proclaims that Nikita is the current uncrowned U.S. Heavyweight Champion after the heinous attack from Magnum during the contract signing. So, as Ivan yanks the belt away from Crockett, Magnum comes back out to the booth to pry the belt away from him. He clocks Ivan over the head with it, and at this point, I figured he was going to throw Ivan back into the ring and start putting the boots to him until the rest of the Russians ran down to gang up on him. No, instead, Magnum casually hands the belt to Tony. He walks off, and Ivan gets back up, sells his head, and then he begins cutting a scathing promo at the booth. And amidst the chaos with Ivan ranting and raving, we just transitioned to Gorgeous Jim Garvin versus Tony Zane, which was not very noteworthy, aside from the realization that Ivan just kind of vanished from the interview booth entirely. The most surprising thing of the whole match was Garvin being able to hoist up that big lub of goo for a brainbuster. Looked like a struggle, but he got the big fucker up. Credit where it's due. His aftermath promo was fun, though. If for no other reason than, while he's joking about Wahoo taking things way too personally with Garvin, thus forcing Crockett Promotions to book them in a leather strap match for the Bash Tour, Garvin stops his train of thought midway through so that he can pull Precious out from behind the podium and showboat how beautiful she is to the public. And then he brings her back so that he can finish by saying that he's got a lot on his mind, but the one thing he knows is that Indians are not as tough as they look. And this right here is the perfect model for why scripted promo material in wrestling is ass. We had the update on the third of the 3 Rock and Roll Express contest series. This one being the Dream Date contest, open to all the adult ladies. And I still love that the catch with the Win a Date contest is that the entrants must submit an essay on why they believe they should be the one to win a date with Ricky and Robert. No more than 500 words. I can just imagine the peer editing that went into this. I'm surprised they didn't have Tony say, also must be submitted in Times New Roman 12-point font, double-spaced with 1.5-inch margins. Also must include a works cited page. And by the way, this whole thing is made better by Jim Cornette standing there next to Tony, smiling and covering his face in a facetious manner. Probably thinking to himself, what in the fuck is going on here? And he's mostly making a whole mockery of the contest by putting over that any female that would actually want to spend a night with Ricky and Robert are sexually depraved. Says that Big Bubba is the new sex symbol for all the ladies. And right before he introduces his boys for the next match, he takes a couple more shots at Baby Doll trying to enter a man's world and that no one would ever want to back her. Except Magnum and Dusty, I guess. And then we had the Midnight's Wrestling Sam Houston and Denny Brown, which actually ended up being a hell of a little TV match, all things considered. A rare circumstance where Dennis and Bobby could feed for 2 undercard guys that could actually work. We should have gotten a little more time, though, because it didn't go all that long before the heels cut off Houston with a stun gun on the top rope and pinned him. We did get a great line from Corny in this match. While he's plugging his boys as being the best tag team, because only the best wear belts, he pauses, and then he goes, well, I take it back. Baby Doll wears a belt, but that's only because she can't find stretch pants that fit around her big waist. And I'll tell you this, if there's one man that is stoked to see Baby Doll get her hands on Jim Cornette during the Bash, it is David Crockett. This man cannot wait to see Corny get humiliated. Tully and JJ did a very short promo. I wrote absolutely nothing down about it. I believe they plugged the tape fist match that Tully's going to be having with Ronnie Garvin, and something about Tully consulting with boxing champion Sugar Ray Leonard to learn how to properly tape fist to prepare for fights. And then we had Wahoo McDaniel versus Thunderfoot. They went about 2 minutes, and Wahoo won with a chop. Once again, absolutely nothing of note to discuss. And then we close with the Paul Jones Army doing another wacky heel promo on Jimmy Valiant. It begins perfectly with Jones flubbing over thanking Crockett for allowing the Army to finally rid Crockett from the NWA. He meant Jimmy Valiant. And then Baron takes over, says that he's never needed the black glove to beat anyone, despite the fact that we've seen Baron win his last several matches using the glove gimmick. And he said something else here at the end, but he got totally drowned out because as soon as Baron had said the word pole, the crowd began heckling him by mocking his pronunciation of the word po. I also think Watley screamed a bunch of incoherent verbiage too. Overall, a decent show. Not as fun as last week, but there's still a lot of good material here. It is technically, if you really think about throughout the scope of history, it's sort of the first sighting of the full Four Horsemen group after they officially recognized them as the Four Horsemen. Obviously, they had been working together prior in '85, but they were never officially recognized as the Four Horsemen until early '86. And shortly thereafter, Ole was gone, and it was only Flair, Tully, and Arn for most of the year. So now that we have the reunion of all four guys under the official brand or banner of the Four Horsemen, this is kind of like their official debut as a full unit. And like I mentioned earlier on, it just sucks that the original group was only really a full functioning group for a little over a year before Ole kind of phased out of the equation by '87. Not trying to get too knee-deep into spoilers or anything, but that's also not necessarily groundbreaking news, especially if you are aware of your Horseman history and the 37 different incarnations of that group over the span of 10 years. And that'll bring us to this edition of World Class Championship Wrestling from June 18th, 1983, which was primarily centered around the main event match, a Brass Knuckles Championship match between Terry Gordy and Kerry Von Erich. Not to say that everything else on the show was completely futile, but, well, let's just say the other segments on the show were just kind of there. It should also be noted that because this show was taped before the official airing of the Star Wars show, Buddy Roberts was working a match on this show with a full head of hair. And I guess if we're speaking in terms of watching the show on a tape delay schedule, this technically is the actual go-home show for the Star Wars event. I think I had said last week that it was the go-home show, which technically isn't wrong because the Star Wars event was taped on June 17th, but of course they didn't start actually airing the matches until the 25th. Yeah, it's that wacky world of classic pro wrestling where everyone basically existed in a time machine, and matches were taped and aired on delay all the time, so you can never really keep track of what went down on specific locations on certain dates unless you legitimately wrote them down in a notebook somewhere and kept track of it, i.e. Jim Cornette. But anyway, like I said, this was the official go-home show before we began seeing the series of Star Wars matches aired on television. The opening match was the Iceman and Johnny Mantell versus Buddy Roberts and the Mongol. I will always appreciate Mercer trying to draw attention to the significance of the warrior-influenced haircut of the Mongol. It's only slightly more offensive than Mike Bond's coconut head-inspired hairdo, but it's also still hideously wretched. Not necessarily a haircut that's going to win you over with the ladies, if you know what I'm saying. Match itself wasn't bad. Mantell and Roberts did some nice mat work in there when they were legal. Mongol was his usual slow, lumbering self, and Iceman was fun to watch. One thing you'll never hear from wrestling historians is how much of a great worker King Parsons was, but man, especially in that Dallas territory, that dude was white hot. Not on the same level as the Von Erichs, but in terms of serving as an upper mid-card second-tier babyface, most definitely. The initial finish actually happened off-camera, with Mongol getting the pin on Mantell after a running stampede, and the Iceman was battling with Buddy Roberts on the outside. And while I'm not entirely sure how the Mongol pinning Mantell was supposed to hard sell the showdown between the Iceman and Buddy Roberts for the Star Wars card, Match sufficed as a teaser. Kamala had a quick squash against Mike Reed, which was there and done. Literally nothing to say about it. And they came back from commercial break for the official debut of Devastation Inc.'s newest member, Mr. Ebony, which seemed very strange for them to debut a new character on their show, or on the go-home show, before one of their big summer events. I figured this would have been something to maybe introduce at the actual Star Wars show to get people talking, but no, they did it here. Mr. Ebony was better known as Tom Jones, who I actually don't know a whole lot about in terms of his wrestling career. He was mostly around during the 60s and 70s, but as far as territories he worked or any notable feuds or matches, I really couldn't find a whole lot on the guy. There are clips of him on YouTube working with guys like The Spoiler, Sheik, and Bobby Jaggers, so based on that information alone, I know he was working in places like Houston or Florida. I guess in the case of the Sheik, he was in Detroit. So he's definitely floating around the country. And you know your career is probably not too remarkable when no one bothers to dedicate a wiki page to you. Ebony ended up winning with the sitting full Nelson via ref stoppage. And then they did a post-match interview with Skandar Akbar, challenging the babyfaces to try and stand up to Devastation Inc.'s group. Once again, firmly calling out the Von Erichs, as he has been in recent promos on Dallas TV. He wants suitable competition. That's the extent of the message here. And, you don't get much more suitable competition than Kerry, Kevin, or David. I will tell you that. Following that, in preparation for the main event, we had one of the greatest video packages of all time. Amidst Kerry Von Erich going through his workout routine and the dubbed-over WWE music, it would appear that the message they were trying to display was that Kerry Von Erich had the eye of the tiger, which would have been perfect timing if they actually had the original song from Survivor. Because that song came out in what year? Was it 83? Or was it the year prior? Might have been the year prior. Anyway, main event is the brass knuck match between Terry Gordy and Kerry. And for those of you that are not too accustomed to gimmick matches around this point, it is essentially a tape fist match. There's nothing pertaining to the actual usage of brass knuckles at any point in the match. And as we've essentially covered throughout every single Freebird Von Erich encounter, it's usually great no matter what the pairing is. Terry ended up gigging very early on, which seemed odd in the context of the story because typically it's the babyface that gigs in these kinds of matches so that the heel can work him over. Here they went with the opposite. But Terry ended up dumping out Kerry over the top rope behind the ref's back while Hayes ran interference, worked him over for the heat. Eventually, Hayes tried to run interference on the apron once Kerry started milking the comeback, so outruns Kevin to chase him around ringside. And while David Manning's on the outside dealing with him, Kerry grabs a handful of Hayes' hair, pulls him up on the ring apron, and then Terry gives him the running knee to the back from behind to pick up the win. And of course, the crowd's super pissed about this fucked finish, so they're all chanting, "We want 5! We want 5!" Meaning they wanted 5 more minutes. Which is kind of amusing when you think about wrestling chants that you never hear in the business anymore. Like, normally you hear people do the 5 more minutes chant after like a time limit draw or something, but definitely not when the babyface gets screwed out of a match. That's almost unheard of in today's business. But this is all well and good. I will say one thing about this match. Kevin Von Erich may be the only straight man I've ever seen that can actually rock the thigh-high cutoff jean shorts. And then we got the final segment, which was the Freebirds hyping up their matches for the Star Wars show, all of which were fantastic. Hayes in particular calling Bruiser Brody a sellout for having the gall to team with Kerry Von Erich in the tag match for their belts. And once again, the Buddy Roberts Iceman story, it's all centered around Buddy's gimmicked hair removal cream, which he vows that he will smear all over the Iceman's head so that he'll be bald as a cue ball by next week. And oh boy, did that plan backfire on him. As a go-home show, it was very effective. And again, we'll be covering the Star Wars matches on tape delay over the next couple weeks as they air them on the shows. So stay posted for that. Also stay posted for the coming Monday show, where I plan on taking the time to review the NWA Always Ready pay-per-view from last weekend. Little late to the party with it, but it'll give me a chance to run down that show and talk about NWA's follow-up episode of Power. We'll also be doing probably the normal Cliff's Notes rundown of Rampage, the lowlights, the highlights, and mostly just jumping over the stuff in between that doesn't matter. But we'll try to make it exciting. So thanks for watching, everyone. Take care. Peace.